Good afternoon. Welcome to this TPC webinar series session, Ticketing from Home, practical privacy tips to keep yours and your customers' data secure. Will be underway in a little while. Just waiting for people to join. Reminder, tomorrow, last one of the week, Katie Rains, 2 o'clock, after the interval, her results of her national audience survey. Over 425 of you signed up for that one, so it's going to be quite awesome in the Q&A, that one. And next week we've got a digital theme going on, starting on Monday with Brian Healy from Untitled. But we'll be underway shortly with Andrew Sharp in just a couple of minutes' time. Okay, so it's just after 3 o'clock, so I think we'll make a start. I can still see the last few people joining, but we can crack on and get into some introductions for this TPC webinar series. Delighted we have Andrew Sharp from Secursys with us today as our guest speaker. Welcome wherever you are in the world. Really impressed with the sign-ups for this one and the level of person, and some CEOs, some FDs, some CIOs, so really people taking it seriously, that security and privacy whilst we go through this these strange times. So that's really good to see. If you've been on one of these before, pretty standard format. That's me at the top, Andrew Thomas. I helped run the Ticketing Professionals Conference. They got cancelled this year or postponed, so we've moved a lot of this content online. We're going to be about 45 to 60 minutes, pretty tight today, hopefully, on the 60 minutes, because there's other things happening. We're recording the session, so if you do have to nip off or get distracted by kids or pets, it will be on demand from about 5 o'clock this evening on the website. There's a presentation by Andrew, some discussion points probably that'll come up, and then Q&A. If you haven't used Zoom webinar before, there's a Q&A box at the top or bottom of your Zoom control panel. Hit that, type your question in, and then we'll get through that. And you can thumbs up and like other people's questions if you think they're particularly relevant, to get the best ones or the ones that are most pressing to the top. And we'll try and get through those. There is also some materials referenced in the presentation, and Andrew will say at the end, other Andrew will say how you can get hold of those. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to the other Andrew, Mr. Andrew Sharp.
Thank you, other Andrew Thomas. Let me share my screen. Here we go. The joys of Zoom. So ticketing from home, giving you a privacy perspective to that in these interesting and challenging times. Why I'm doing this is partly because I work for Secursys, which is a specialized consultancy who do privacy as a living and try and find ways of making it practical for all sorts of organizations. But also in terms of my personal background, I've been in your sector for 21 years. 1999, I moved into the black hole that is ticketing, from which there is little escape. I started as managing director of Box. I worked for First Call. I worked for Seaton when that took over First Call. I ended up working for Ticket Switch and Enter. I joined Y-Plan. I've worked at De Winters. So I've been around the sector for quite a while. And we have a number of clients in this space who we advise on privacy, but we also advise other folk. I'd like to get a quick picture of who we're talking to. I've seen a list of participants on Zoom and lots of familiar names on there, so hi to everybody who knows me. but I'd like to understand whether you are actually currently ticketing from home or not, and if you're doing it, whether you're doing it on your machine or on a machine from your business. So our first poll, please, pollster.
So this is, for those watching on demand, the question is, are you ticketing or marking from home using, one, a computer provided by your organisation, your own computer, or not applicable? And I can see the votes flying in now. 75% voted. We'll close it off after 85%, because we're about there. We're 84, 86, there we go. All done. And we'll just share those now. 63% a computer provided by your organisation, 23% your own, and 13% are not currently ticketing or marketing from home. Andrew, over to you.
Thank you. That's an impressive number of people who are managing to work on a machine provided by their organisation. We'll come back to that, but there are some people out there who aren't, who I can help with some hints and tips if they haven't already had them from the office. So the agenda, we'll go through the basics of data protection and information security to make sure we're all talking about the same thing very, very briefly. Then focus a bit on ticketing from home. What does that mean for privacy during lockdown? What sorts of things have changed? And then I've got some action checklists for you, depending what your role is, of things to think about and go away and look at. We will obviously be putting this up on demand if you want to revisit those, so you don't need to make copious notes. I will also post them up on LinkedIn in due course, and for those who've opted in to hear from us afterwards, we'll email them out. So, those of you who remember back to your last GDPR refresher training, if you're based in Europe, will doubtless recognise the contents of Article 5 and the data protection principles. Those elsewhere in the world, your local privacy legislation may be different to this, but certainly the European model is that data protection is very principles driven. It says that if you want to process personal data, which is any piece of information about an identified or identifiable human being, and harking back to yesterday's seminar, there was a question around analytics, and yes, cookie IDs are considered personal data. If you want to process personal data, you must do it in a way that is lawful, fair, and transparent, and there are only a limited number of things that are lawful or lawful bases on which to process data. It's got to be fair to the data subject. You've got to be transparent and tell them what you're doing. You must process data only for specific purposes that you have determined in advance. You can't grab data and then decide to do what you want to do with it later. The data you hold needs to be accurate, which not only means correct at the time you gathered it, but if appropriate, correct at the time you use it. So you need to have ways of keeping it up to date. The minimization principle says you should only process as much data as is needed to do the job, no more, but also importantly, no less. So have the right amount of data for whatever it is you're trying to do. The retention principle says you shouldn't keep personal data as personal data any longer than you need it for the purpose you got it for in the first place. You can make it non-personal by aggregating it and genuinely anonymizing it and hold it for other purposes, such as trend analysis and so on, but in personal form, only for as long as necessary for the first purpose. And the big one, which we're going to talk about mostly today, is you need to keep that data secure. You need to protect that data. So on to the information security side of things. If you've been involved in information security audits and things at your organization, or got involved in filling out horrendous self-assessment questionnaires for PCI and so forth, you may have come across some of this terminology, but let's get it out there for everybody else. This statement, we take appropriate technical and organizational measures to ensure the security of all personal data information we hold. Where does that come from? Probably almost everybody on this conference's privacy notice. It's a very standard piece of text in privacy notices. And the reason it's there, certainly in Europe, is because that's exactly what European and UK data protection legislation says you must do, and you must tell people how you do it. Most people choose not to tell them how they do it, simply to tell them the fact that they do it. So I imagine that comes from your privacy notice. I did lift this from one particular venue group's privacy notice, but you'll probably find it in almost everybody's. But have you ever thought about what it really means? Let's start with the risks. Information security is a very risk-driven practice, and the three big risks it considers, this is known as the CIA triad, is confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So if you lose confidentiality, the information you're trying to protect, whether it's personal data or just confidential information, has become known to somebody that it shouldn't be known to. So you've had a data breach, somebody has got hold of your data that shouldn't have it. If you've had an integrity breach, that means your data has been corrupted in some way. So it may have been partially deleted, it may have been changed. And finally, availability. If you've got an availability breach, it means when you need that data, you can't get to it. And what information security professionals do is spend their lives figuring out what is likely to cause those risks in your organization. And then they will take technical and organizational measures to try and reduce that risk or transfer that risk. So you would have seen that term bandied around a lot, technical and organizational measures, but if you've never stopped to think, what's the difference? Here's a fascinating fact for a pub quiz one night. Technical measures are, as the name would suggest, where the technology is helping protect the data. So from a confidentiality perspective, encrypting the data in your database, putting password protection on your applications and your devices, and configuring your firewall appropriately are all technical measures that improve confidentiality and reduce confidentiality risk. Organizational measures are things that change people's behavior without imposing it on them through technology. So your password protection, you might have a rule that says you must change your password every 90 days. Now you could simply have a written policy that says that and not enforce it with a technology, in which case it's an organizational measure, or you could configure your system to put that irritating message up every time you're trying to do something urgent, telling you that you need to change your password first. That's the difference. If the technology imposes it, it's a technical measure. If the corporation, the business imposes it, it's an organizational measure. And typical organizational measures are having an acceptable use policy, which explains what it is okay to do when with your device and with people's personal data. You've probably got a policy that says it's fine to look up a customer's sales history when they're in front of you and you're trying to help them. It's not fine to look up your neighbour's transaction history during your lunch break because you wonder whether they like musicals. That's exactly the sort of thing an acceptable use policy would control, where you can't put a technical measure in place because you need to be able to do this for your job, but you need to be told that you mustn't when it isn't your job. That's where policies come in. A clear desk policy is another example of an organizational measure that will help address risk, as is staff training. So that's the baseline of the sort of terminology we're going to be using in starting to think like privacy and information security professionals. And while you're ticketing from home, you all need to be privacy and information security professionals. Let's look at why. The threats to your information, principally around confidentiality, have changed whilst you are at home. Because you're now in a different working environment, and that will influence the way you behave, and it will change some of the risks. For example, are you using a corporate device or a home device? We now know that, was it 23%, Andrew? It was a minority, yeah, but a substantial minority are working on a home device. That device is not directly controlled by your IT department. You can't rely on them to look after it for you. Your corporate device, you probably can, but it depends whether they've got enough remote device management to continue doing the things that they do for you while you're in the office. You're on your home network. It wasn't designed for this stuff. You're also competing for bandwidth with kids watching Netflix and other people working in the house and who knows what. But most importantly, that network is under your control and not under your company's control. So you are the relevant security professional for this network. Your space was not designed for secure working, most likely. That's partly about the presence of other humans. So I'm talking to you from my dining room. I have the door shut. There's nobody else around. There are birds outside the window. You may hear some tweeting occasionally, standing in for Roger Tomlinson, who normally does that at conferences. There's a pair of wrens nesting in the bush, so I apologise if they interrupt. But were I sitting in the kitchen, people would be coming and going and looking over my shoulder. That would not be a smart place to be processing confidential data, and your working space is similarly going to have some risks like that in it. Some of you are taking on new roles. I've heard tales of chief executives rolling up their sleeves and processing ticketing orders for the first time in many years. That brings risk because it's not something they regularly do, and have they had all the right training and do they understand all the right policies? We're all doing an awful lot of online meetings. These are really weird. And we've come across a number of issues with people having problems with meeting platforms and inadvertently sharing things they didn't want to share. So making sure that you know how to use your online meeting tools is important. It's probably not something you do every day in your normal life, and suddenly you spend your entire life on Zoom, Teams, Skype, GoToMeeting, insert name of preferred platform here. Not Zoom in our case, but there you go. That's because we're privacy professionals. You're also subject to remote IT support to some extent. So as I said further up, you might be managing your own device. You are definitely managing your own network. You're completely reliant on somebody on the other end of a phone or a Skype call to help you with anything. And that exposes you to some new risks, because you're more likely to respond to somebody ringing you up, telling you that they are from your IT department. And that's a very common attack method for folks who want to get control of your machine and snoop on personal data and install malware and stuff like that. And particularly at this point, we're seeing a lot of reports of increased criminal activity using COVID as a cover. Because people are working from home, people are in an unusual situation, people have a heightened state of tension, they are more likely to respond to a phishing attack or some other attack that is attempting to distribute malware or get hold of personal information or persuade them to divert a payment to the wrong place. There was a story only this morning of some fund manager being conned out of millions of euros and moving it to the wrong account. Because most of these attacks rely on a sense of urgency and making you fear that if you don't do this, you'll be doing something wrong. So these kind of phishing attacks and malware attacks normally start, you've probably had them on your phone at home anyway, saying your broadband is going to be cut off in 5 days unless you do something like that, at which point in the normal world you hang up. But in a COVID world, if somebody says your company is eligible for this, you need to click here, there's a chance you'll respond slightly differently. So time for our next poll. How many people have received a suspicious COVID-themed message?
So that was the question. Have you received any messages about COVID asking you to click on a link for more information and to claim a payment? 70, let's get above 80% voted. And we'll close it off there and share the results on the screen. 67% no, 33% yes. Over a third of people have received messages about claiming payments due to COVID. Andrew.
Well spotted, those folks who figured they were suspicious and did nothing about them, I hope. And interesting that 66% haven't had any messages at all, because the government claims to have delivered a message to everybody in the country via their mobile phone with a link to find out more information about COVID, but perhaps you thought that wasn't suspicious. I must say, when it first arrived, everybody at our organisation thought very, very carefully about whether they were going to click on that link. But then we're paranoid for a living, that's what we do. onwards. So I think the most helpful thing to do, given that this is about ticketing, is to look at security at home from the perspective of PCI-DSS. Because whilst privacy legislation in most countries is fairly generic and it says you need to abide by these principles, you need to have appropriate technical and organizational measures, PCI-DSS is a little more prescriptive. If you want to take payment cards, you have a contractual arrangement with your bank that says you will take the following security measures. These are non-negotiable. So let's look at it from that perspective, because I think that will flush out some helpful thoughts about what has changed while you're working at home. Most of you who've probably not been through a PCI audit, they're a real joy. Now is your lucky day. So the first thing PCI requires you to do is to secure your network. And guess who's now in charge of the network you're working at? That's you, because you're working from home on your home Wi-Fi. So the first thing that your organization has asserted to your bank is that you have installed and maintained a firewall which will protect cardholder data. So you need to make sure you have. It's not terribly hard. Most laptops, most desktops, most operating systems have one built in on the device. This is not going and getting a big shiny box with blinking lights on it and putting it next to your router. This can be taken care of on your desktop. Just make sure it's switched on. Secondly, you have assured your bank that you will not use vendor-supplied defaults for system passwords and any other security parameters. That's mostly already taken care of on your corporate network because you're smart enough to reconfigure every piece of device you have in the office. But at home, if you have other devices and your own laptop, have they got decent passwords on them? So make sure your laptop has a strong password. You might want to think about changing the default password on your Wi-Fi router. I wouldn't get particularly excited about that because they tend to be pretty good. But there are lots of other devices on your Wi-Fi network that probably have default passwords that you can't change if you're a home of the future and you have smart plugs and speakers you can shout at to play the radio for you and so forth. They've all got passwords as well. So we need to think about those. I think the better answer is to isolate yourself from them when doing this kind of work rather than to change their passwords. But we'll come back to that in a minute. You're next required to assert that you have appropriate methods to protect cardholder data. So stored cardholder data must be protected. And it goes into more detail about encryption in particular for electronic records. Working from home, you should not be storing any cardholder data other than on your ticketing system or payment service provider's system. In particular, you will doubtless have been instructed, do not write it down. This is why, because if you write it down, you're going to be responsible for protecting it to your company's security standards. And make sure that when you do transmit cardholder data across open and public networks, that it is encrypted. You will be doing that either by logging on to an externally hosted system that you can access directly from your home device, or by using remote desktop to get into your corporate network and then using it there. But you need to be making sure that those connections are appropriately encrypted. And one of the last links in that is the link between your device and your Wi-Fi. And making sure that's encrypted. And there's a very simple way to do that, which we'll come to as well.
Andrew, can I just come in with a question? Because it's very relevant to that point there. It's on the Q&A. I know we're having Q&A at the end, but it's specifically about that. And Ewan asks, if the agents taking sales, if the agents that are taking sales are on a VPN and a remote desktop on a PC to a PC in the office, do they still need a local firewall? Should we mull that one over and come back to it?
I think the answer is yeah. Why wouldn't you? Yes, because that will protect the cardholder data. It stops somebody getting straight onto that machine. If that machine is only connected to the VPN and not connected to any other Wi-Fi, then I can see the point. But as a matter of principle, I would make sure it is configured on the laptop or the desktop. Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
Thanks.
Thanks, Ewan, for that question. Thanks, Andrew.
Next step, maintain a vulnerability management program. So your company has agreed with the bank that they will use and regularly update antivirus software or programs. Now, if you're now on your own device, you need to help with this. So you need to make sure that antivirus programs are kept up to date. I think you probably mostly know how to do that, but it's on the checklist when we get there. Next, your company has agreed to develop and maintain secure systems and applications. You'll be pleased to hear that whilst ticketing from home, this is generally not your problem because you're using a third-party ticketing system or a system provided by your employer, and they are responsible for developing and maintaining it and possibly upgrading it and keeping it up to date in the same way that you would antivirus. I know a number of organisations have gone through upgrades during lockdown, which is bold and well done, but a good move. I know some have actually managed to change systems during lockdown, which is extraordinary. So well done to them.
Some of them are on this call.
Well done them. Next, access control measures. So there are 3 of these. Restrict access to cardholder data by the business need to know. So nobody in your business, and by extension, your household, since you're now running your business outside the office, should have access to cardholder data unless they need to. And this is exactly why you need to be sitting somewhere secure, working in a way that means you can't be overseen, and you can't be listened to. Secondly, unique IDs. This one's already controlled for you by your ticketing system. Don't worry about it. You will all be using individual logons. And physical access to cardholder data, again, in this scenario, is talking about being somewhere secure where nobody else can get access to data. And that's one of the reasons you don't write it down at home, because you're not equipped with lockable filing cabinets and with shredders and so forth. Monitoring and testing your network. Track and monitor all access to network resources and cardholder data. Most of this goes on your ticketing system, and in practice, there's not a great deal you can do about this from home. So I wouldn't worry too much about that one. Testing security systems and processes, again, really is much more of a corporate responsibility than a personal one at home. But hey, we're all involved in the biggest disaster recovery test in living memory. And for most people, it seems to be going pretty well. So well done. Finally, maintain an information security policy. So you should have a policy that talks about information security. You've claimed you've got one. It's probably in a drawer somewhere. If people haven't read it recently, now might be a good time. And if it talks about home working, now might be a good time for a reminder. We'll come back to that in the checklist as well. The second area to think about whilst you're still ticketing from home is what's going to happen when everybody returns to work. And here we begin to stray outside pure ticketing and into venue management and marketing and so forth. But are you thinking about whether you need to track your staff's symptoms in order to know whether they're allowed back into work? Are you thinking about having a blue team and a green team coming in at different shifts and deciding who's not on either of those because they live with somebody who's vulnerable? Are you thinking about whether you should be doing contract tracing in your venue or your office? Lots of organizations around the world are doing this stuff, and lots of regulators have very differing views about it. So we need to tread extremely carefully. We'll come back to that. And actually reopening your buildings to the public. What are you planning to do around marketing to cancelled bookers? Have you got their consent to do that? Have they signed up for marketing? Or is it a service email to say, guess what, you can now buy another ticket? I'm not sure it would be. So we need to think a little bit carefully about marketing. Are you planning, once you've reopened, to have all sorts of distancing measures in place and capacity management measures in place that you wouldn't normally have? And does that involve doing all sorts of innovative processing of personal data? Are you planning to check people's temperatures before they come into your building to see whether they appear to be symptomatic? Apple was planning to reopen its stores and do that. You couldn't go in unless you had a normal temperature. And the German data protection regulator in particular is all over them, saying that that is inappropriate processing of medical data. So this one's a minefield, and it varies from country to country. So we'll come back to that one. So that's the picture we're looking at, ticketing from home and the sorts of things that are now your responsibility because you're part of the network where you weren't before and you're less supported by corporate resources. Let's get into some checklists about what you can do to help get through this. Firstly, if you are remotely involved in managing information security in your organization, now would be a jolly good time for a review. Your policy probably says, we review the risk register on an annual basis, or we review it on a quarterly basis. Don't forget, you might prompt a review because something has happened and risks appear to have changed. So if you haven't had an information security meeting recently at which you've gone through your risk register from top to bottom, looking for what's changed, now is the time. What's changed, either its likelihood, so it's more likely to happen, or its impact, it would be more disastrous than usual if it happened to us now. We sat down and did this quite early in the beginnings of the pandemic and started making sure we had plans for working from home. And judging by the number of corporate machines out there, most of you have done the same thing. You have made sure that people were carrying their laptops with them at all time, ready for an imminent lockdown. You were procuring more devices before you couldn't get one for love nor money. So most of you have probably done some of this, but if you haven't done it recently, and we're now a couple of months in, what have we learned in those 2 months that changes the risk from what we thought they were 2 weeks before lockdown? So have a review. What risks do you think have changed? In particular, have a look at PCI. Almost all of you are filling in self-assessment questionnaires and sending them off to say, here's what we do. There are very few level 1 service providers in the ticketing sector who actually have an external auditor come in and ask them and check these things. But even if you have, whichever camp you fall into, dig out your last assessment and see what it said. What did you say you had in place? And actually, now that people are working from home, is it really still in place? And if it isn't, what can you do about that? And some of that is about communicating the sort of hints and tips we're talking about here to make sure that the people working at home are temporarily part of your security measures because they're doing things that somebody else would normally do for them. So have a look at those technical and organizational measures that you've put in place as a result of your risk review and your PCI-DSS compliance, and just make sure that they are still in place and that they are effective. Do any of them need to be changed? If you have a blanket clear desk policy, does it apply when you're working from home? Have you got a working from home policy? If you're one of the 20-something% working on your own device, have you actually got a bring your own device or working from home policy which explains what is expected of staff in these circumstances? And if you have, is it up to date and has it stood the test of the last 8 weeks? If not, now would be a good time to review it because this ain't over yet. Secondly, this is for pretty much everybody. You are working from home. What can you do to secure your own home working environment? Firstly, if you are connecting to your home Wi-Fi, whether it's on your device or work device, and whether or not you're also then using a VPN, really, make sure that you are connected to your home Wi-Fi as though it were a public network, not a trusted network. And the little graphic there is this, that's how you do it on Windows. There's a very similar facility on Apple. What that means is that no other device on your Wi-Fi, whether that's other computers around the network, whether it's your smart TV, whether it's your smart speaker, whether it's that really cool voice controlled plug that you bought on Amazon, can see your home computer or your work computer. So it's isolating you from the rest of your network. That's really helpful in reducing risk of anything else trying to grab hold of your data and grab hold of your network. Secondly, as we said, make sure that the firewall is configured on your computer. They ship with it on by default generally, but have a quick look and make sure that Windows Firewall or the firewall built into Apple is turned on. And then a number of steps that we've alluded to already about protecting confidential data. Most of these are going to be in your remote working policy if you've got one. Try and have a secure working space. Find yourself somewhere where you will not be overlooked and overheard. Make sure your computer is locked when you are away from it if you share your space with anybody else. Don't maintain any insecure paperwork. So not only don't write down cardholder details, because that's a PCI nightmare, but also if you're working with any customer data that isn't PCI covered, then just remember you need to protect that and have appropriate organizational and technical measures. Now, the appropriate measures might be a locked filing cabinet if you're in the office working with paper records. Increasingly, we're not. But if you are, think about how you can secure them at home. And if you can't secure them at home, don't do it on paper. One of the advantages of connecting to your home Wi-Fi as a public network is it will stop you printing stuff out. That's partly why you should do it. Really, if you can avoid it, don't work in a room with Internet of Things cameras and smart speakers around. Some of them are more secure than others. But imagine you're on the phone to your lovely customer Alexa and she asks for something and you read back her order to her. You're going to end up recording that and sending it off into the ether. And if you've got one of the more hackable devices, then who knows who is looking over your shoulder in your apparently secure working space or listening into you as you talk to customers on the phone. So keep away from voice activated and Wi-Fi enabled devices if you can. I alluded before to screen sharing. Make sure you know how to set up your chosen company meetings and whoever else meetings. I don't imagine you're doing video calls with bookers, but with other people. It's very easy, if you don't configure this right, to share your entire desktop rather than share a particular window. And in doing that, there's a serious risk of pop-up notifications appearing. There are a couple of platforms which suppress those automatically. I did a blog on LinkedIn about this fairly recently. Go have a look. Mostly the Microsoft ones. Teams automatically puts you into do not disturb mode and stops you having any notifications while you're sharing. Skype will do that if you've asked it to, but not if you haven't. Most of the rest won't, in which case you need to be sure you're sharing a window and not sharing your desktop. I've had conversations with clients who've got themselves into a bit of a pickle, hovering over a document in the taskbar accidentally whilst in a meeting and popping up a thumbnail of that document which had confidential data in it. I'm sure we've all been in meetings where you've had an email notification or a chat notification come up which you rather wish the other people in the meeting hadn't seen. So learn how to configure your screen sharing. And finally, it's doubtless in all your policies, but do not share your device with other people. This is partly about that password control and unique ID, but it's also just about making sure that you've really got control of that device. This lockdown must have been a nightmare for households that don't have a one-to-one match between devices and people. We do some work with schools and they're talking about households where there's one laptop and the children are having to rotate it around. Luckily, they're not processing bookings and personal data, so less disastrous there. But when you're handling personal data, sharing devices is not a good idea. Next, particularly if you are on your own machine, but also if your corporate IT team is not able to manage your device now that you're at home, you need to make sure that it has up-to-date software on it. Not least the operating system. There are regular patches to operating systems that make them more secure. On Windows, go down to the bar at the bottom and type Windows Update, and it will bring you up a little status screen which will tell you whether or not there are some updates waiting to load. And if there are, do it. We do this on a once-a-week basis, and we all report into the duty security officer to say we've done it. That's the kind of business we are. Your business probably has a policy about how often you should do this. If it doesn't have a policy, make one up now. And I'd go for weekly if I were you. It takes a few minutes normally, unless Microsoft have done a monster ship on a Tuesday, and then you're out of action for 45 minutes. So maybe do it Wednesday lunchtime. Your Office applications and anything else like that you're using, if you are, to process data. On Windows, you need to go into advanced options in Windows Update and tell it, when you update Windows, update any other Microsoft product, please. On Apple, you just need to go into the App Store and click Updates, and it'll tell you whether any of your apps need updating, and then it will update them. Make sure your browser is up to date. Some of these are not updated through the typical App Store process. If you're on Chrome on Windows or Apple, go to Help and About Chrome, and it will tell you what build number it is, and it'll go away and check whether that's the latest one. Firefox and others have similar mechanisms, usually in their Help or Check for Updates options. Any other applications you are using to process personal data, make sure they're up to date. There was a release of Adobe PDF Reader this week, for example, which has some fixes in it. Go download that if it's one of the ones you're using. Making sure antivirus and things like that are running. Take a look at the security console on Windows, if that's your chosen platform. And if you see a little row of green ticks telling you all is wonderful, relax and go make a cup of coffee. If one of them's got the little yellow triangle, then something has happened to your virus or firewall settings and it needs your attention. Very occasionally, a Microsoft update will interrupt some of these things, so this one is worth an occasional check. Might as well do it weekly, it takes another 30 seconds. If you're not using built-in management of antivirus through Windows, then go and check your chosen antivirus. And although you did it on the previous slide, thinking about your secure working environment, just recheck it from time to time. Has anything changed? Now, are you sitting in a second floor flat? You can't possibly be overlooked, and somebody has subsequently put scaffolding up. You might want to turn yourself around and be facing away from the window, for example. Just scan your environment on a regular basis, again, maybe weekly. Has anything changed here that changes the risk to my confidentiality? If you haven't all had or delivered loads of staff awareness training, that might be a good thing to do at this point as well. You probably had a rather hasty retreat to home with some untested policies or not recently tested policies and processes, and you've learned a lot in the last few weeks. So consolidate what you've learned and then do a new staff awareness training, because they're still going to be at home for some time. Teach them how to do those working environment checks. Teach them about phishing and malware and not clicking on unexpected links and opening unexpected attachments. Share your hints and tips on safe screen sharing and how not to show embarrassing messages. Give them a refresher on all the relevant policies. If you've got a bring your own device policy or a working from home policy, any other policies that apply in this situation, give them a quick refresher, particularly if you've just changed them as a result of your risk review. And also importantly, make sure people know if they think they've had a security breach or a data breach, who is it they're supposed to talk to? It's a lot easier in an office to turn to the person next to you and say, what am I supposed to do about this? Or just ring the IT folk. Now that we're all working from home, you might need a slightly more formal way of doing that, and just make sure they know how to do it. Time for our next poll. Let's talk about marketing to cancelled bookers on your lawful basis. Andrew.
I'm here, honestly, I was just doing something else. Relaunch poll, click the right button. So, is your marketing to prior bookers currently based on their explicit consent, a soft opt-in approach, or you don't know?
It is acceptable to answer the last one.
31%, 40%. Again, we'll close it when we get over 75%. So just hit a tick. We've anonymized all these. Again, these are not linked to your session ID, so they are completely anonymous. So Zoom tells me another couple, and I'm going to be over 70%. And we'll close it out there. So is your marketing to prior bookers based on 56% have gone for explicit consent, 22% a soft opt-in or implied, 22% don't know. And I'm just sharing that because I was reading that off my screen. So that's the result there. Andrew.
Lovely. Thank you, Andrew. Onwards. So more action plans around return to work. If you're planning any new processing of personal data, you need to think very carefully. Under all European privacy legislation and plenty of others, it is now mandatory to build in privacy by design to all new processing. So whilst you didn't have to do this before 2018, in Europe, you now do. So if you're going to do something different, think very carefully about it from a privacy perspective from the outset. If you are planning on handling any medical data, and that's temperature taking and symptom tracking and all of that stuff, or if you're planning on monitoring public areas, for example, starting to use your CCTV in a different way to try and monitor social distancing, think very carefully about it and involve your privacy and information security people. You may need to do a data protection impact assessment if you're doing something that is handling sensitive data at scale. In particular, you will need to think about the lawfulness of it. Think about your transparency requirements. What are you going to tell people? Think about what's the minimum data I need to do this. Let's not slurp up enormous amounts of data because it might be interesting. Think about how long you're actually going to need it, and think about how you're going to keep that very sensitive data secure. So follow a formal data protection impact assessment process and look at any new processing and keep that document to demonstrate that you have thought very carefully about this and you've decided it's safe, and you've decided it's safe because you're taking all these different measures. And that lawfulness one is particularly interesting around medical data. If you're in the UK, the UK Data Protection Act has a schedule of the conditions under which it is lawful to process medical data. And it's not something employers normally do. So you need to find the right lawful conditions for processing in there to attach to whatever it is you're seeking to do. And the best way to do that is to do this full impact assessment and think about the lawfulness at the same time. If you have a data protection officer, which is a formal role in Europe required by a number of organizations, notably public authorities, then get them to review your data protection impact assessment. They shouldn't be the person doing it. They should be the person overseeing you doing it and giving you advice. That's a bit of a blurred line in some organizations. One for the marketeers. So improving privacy for customers, should you have any brain bandwidth during lockdown. Firstly, those cancelled bookers. Remember whether you have told people you are marketing to them on the basis of consent or on the basis of a soft opt-in. Soft opt-in is perfectly acceptable to prior bookers, and some people use that. But if you have based your marketing historically on consent and a cancelled booker has not consented to marketing, can you now contact them? You need to think that through carefully. It rather depends what you told them when you sent them the cancellation, to be honest. It is possible to switch at that point. We've had one client who did exactly that and notified people that they were cancelling, but soft opting them in to hear about when it would be sensible to rebook, but gave them the opportunity to opt out. So they've given the customer the choice and they've effectively reconsented them, but with a soft consent. Have a look at your website privacy notice. You probably last updated it middle of May 2018 for no apparent reason. Everybody else did. With 2 years experience about the sorts of things you've seen on other people's websites and what customers have asked you, try and see the world through your customer's eyes. If your website privacy policy was written by a lawyer, it will list in one paragraph all of the lawful bases on which you process data. It will list in a separate paragraph how long you retain data. And it will say, for as long as we need it. If you were the customer, wouldn't you like to know which bit of data is being held for what lawful basis and how long you're going to keep it. So if I make a booking with you, obviously you're doing it on contract. How long are you going to keep it afterwards? If I sign up for your email list, you're doing it on consent. How long are you going to keep that? Why not separate out the purposes and explain the lawful basis and retention and anything else you think appropriate more transparently? If you build customer trust, transparency is the key to that. If you haven't already, now would be a very good time to update your website to have proper cookie consent management. Just before we went into the lockdown, the regulators around Europe were all getting very tough on this and saying, you may not drop a non-essential cookie unless you have explicit consent, and you must ensure that it is as easy to withdraw that consent as it was to get it in the first place. If yours is one of the websites that still says, by continuing to browse this site, you accept blah, 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 that is not compliant consent. And if your cookie notice says, if you don't like this, go and read all about cookies and figure out how to delete our cookies, that is not compliant, because that is not as easy to withdraw as to give. And the answer really is a cookie consent platform, which will let your customer decide whether they want personalized experience on the site, let them decide whether they want to be subjected to your digital advertising. Your inclination will be, this is a terrible thing, I'm going to drop less cookies. I'm still waiting to hear back from people who've actually done this and have a smaller cookie pool as to whether the conversion rate on their digital advertising has gone up dramatically. I would expect it to. If the customer has actively opted in to being followed around the internet by an ad for your show, I would expect them to be more likely to buy it. So you might end up spending less on digital advertising with a higher conversion rate. Who knows? I would love to find out. If anybody's already been through that journey, do tell us. For more, as I mentioned, Secursys are on LinkedIn. I've done one item up there about screen sharing. I will put all these different hints and tips up there over the next few days. We've got other webinars, other blog posts. Other good places to go looking for privacy information, if you're in the UK, the ICO, the Information Commissioner's Office, or if you are elsewhere in Europe or anywhere in the world, your local privacy regulator, whoever it is, will have guidance. They will also have COVID guidance. Most of them have put things out saying some very different things. The UK regulator seems reasonably relaxed at the moment about monitoring symptoms in staff, whereas the Italian one said, don't do it, very, very early on in lockdown. So take into account what your local regulator is saying about workplace testing, about symptom monitoring, and most of them have got some guidance on home working. I hope I haven't missed anything they've already said. That's me done. Andrew, questions?
Thank you very much, other Andrew. Questions already coming in, which you can put in the Q&A box. You've already got a couple going in there, and remember, if you see a question that's in there you like, give it a thumbs up and it will bump it up the list. One comment first of all that came in very early was Neil Jones, whose Alexa woke up during your presentation, just to show how sensitive that can be.
My point is made.
The point is...
Hey Google!
Don't. Right. Well, the questions are coming in, and Leon's at the top with 11 thumbs up, but as is customary now, we always ignore the top question. Sorry, Leon. So I want to jump in with one first because I'm conscious of time, and I've got one here, which is, at my office, we save on, we call it the G drive, a server drive. But right now, you and I are working from home. I want to send you a file of this customer list for this mailing, and I'm going to send it to Mail Big File and send it to you. How do we get away? Because surely that's not good. An unencrypted file link that anyone can, I assume, can kind of find and download or anything else. How do we get our staff to not do this and teach them about using not using 101 file sharing services?
I think you would mandate a particular file sharing service. Things like SharePoint or Google Drive will let you do that securely and make them openable only by named people. So it's one of those ones where you need a policy about it, to change people's behavior, and then you take advantage of the technical controls in your chosen platform.
Okay. Right, well, we'll have to go to Leon now because he has got 11 thumbs up. And he asks, of the group here, is anyone still operating a telephone box office service, e.g. routing calls to corporate mobiles? If so, how are you securing card details taken over cellular network? Andrew, have you got anything on that?
I haven't, no. No,
I've heard about some very large organisations doing this of rerouting the call centre, a ACD system to 101 mobile phones. If anyone's got anyone who's doing it and securing it, maybe they can pop it in the comments. You can comment. Andy Kitchen's just commenting there. Business for Skype they're using for
rerouting securely to desktop is a good option.
Yeah, that's what Andy's saying there. Okay, so anyone else wants to comment on that? Brian Andrews says we're using PCI Telecom, which allows us to have a take card details over the phone. Customer card details over the phone. So any more?
Not to have to take them.
Sorry?
He's saying it allows them not to take them.
Oh.
Not clear what that means. Somebody else is taking them, presumably.
Yeah, okay. And there's a question from Andy here, and also I think Danielle seconded it really, which he said, Andy said he'd love to hear more about the venue with soft opt-in for cancelled bookings.
It wasn't a venue, it was a producer. They normally operate only on consent-based marketing, because they tend not to see the customer again. But in this circumstance, when cancelling rather than postponing the booking, they took the view that most customers are going to want to hear when it makes sense to rebook. This is a West End scenario, because the West End has cancelled up to a fixed date and then rolled forward that date and cancelled some more and so on, whereas other people on the call I know have had to cancel their entire season. If you're cancelling on a rolling basis, then every time you process another batch of cancellations, you get a chance to talk to those new cancelled people. And what they did was say, we think you would like to hear when it's safe to rebook. Whether or not you've opted into our normal marketing, we'd like to talk to you about that. We're going to do it based on legitimate interest. You are a prior booker at this point, so soft opt-in is acceptable. Soft opt-in works on the basis that people have been given the opportunity to opt out before you send the message. Normally, you would do that at the checkout. And some people's checkout has a tick opt-in, that's consent and proper consent. Some people have a pre-ticked box that says, as a prior booker, we'd like to talk to you, blah, 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 blah. And if they don't untick it, that under PECA, rather than Data Protection Act, is a soft opt-in and is valid. And you could do the same thing in a cancellation email by saying, we think you're going to want to hear when it makes sense to rebook, but if you don't want to, here's how you opt out. Most people are probably going to want to hear, but there may be some people who've been so affected by this crisis that remembering the fact that they couldn't get to such and such a show with Auntie Maisie, who is sadly no longer with us, maybe a step too far and they want to opt out. So they went the soft opt-in route rather than requiring another opt-in.
Okay. That's a good one. I hope that answers your question, Andy and Danielle. Brian Andrews has just come back, and basically, so PCI Telecom is, from what I understand, he's saying there is it's one of those redirect to an automated system that you put your card number into.
Got it. Yeah, that makes perfect sense.
Good use of a system. I mean, and people had that pre-COVID, so that's a really good.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Brian, for that one. From Rebecca, and if you have got a question, now's the time to get it in because we are quite close for time. Rebecca asks, if someone shares a device, is it okay as long as they have different logins? Andrew?
That certainly helps. And particularly if you're not storing anything on that device, or if that device is partitioned so that if you have stored something, the other login can't get to it. Yes. Yeah. Superb.
One more from Leon here. Anyone's got a last one to get in, do get it in now. His comment is, for corporate devices, you can get your IT administrator to route all internet traffic through the VPN, which puts your home network out of scope.
Okay.
And then he says, got a question about taking card details over the phone, which is obviously the one we answered before. Well, it's more of a comment from Leon, but thank you very much for that. And with that, we are bang on 4 o'clock. If you have got a burning question, pop it in now. 5, 4, 3, 2. I had loads more here, which when we can do it, we must go for a beer because I've got questions for you, Andrew, about this. The one thing I did have here was there was a spate of bit locking before, in the last 12 months. Have you seen is the global trend for that kind of scam and activity dipped, or has it remained constant throughout lockdown?
For ransomware, you're talking about, where it goes off and encrypts your devices. There was a particular vulnerability in some of the older Microsoft platforms, which was exploited by that initially, which is what took down the underfunded organisations in the NHS who got hit. There are still occasional instances of it. There was one last week somewhere I saw a story about. So it is still happening. It's just not hitting as often. Okay.
Well, that was a great session for a Thursday, bang on time as well. Tomorrow, our last one of the week is Katie Rains talking about, I think she's got over 40,000 responses now to her audience survey about when people are wanting to start booking tickets again. So if you haven't got onto that one, that's at 2 p.m. tomorrow. And then we're into a digital week next week. All that remains is for me to say thank you very much to Andrew. You'll be in contact with the people that said they could contact you, because we are conscious of security and privacy here.
Quite right, Tim.
Excellent. And all that remains is to say thank you very much to everyone. Thanks for joining and have a great afternoon.
Thanks, Andrew.